Welcome, everybody. My name is Mina Jane. I'm the director of the Ashland Public Library in Massachusetts, and I'm really thrilled to be here with Madeline Martin, the author of the book, The Book Lovers, no, the book,
The Booklover's Library.
Book Lovers Library is I know that it's like the Librarian Spy and the like.
I know. It's all bookish, so bookish. Yeah.
But your most recent book, The Book Lovers Library, just came out last week. So we're celebrating a book birthday. So if you have some cake on hand, please help yourself to it. Before we get started with our Q&A, though, I just wanted to say thanks to the Friends of the Ashland Public Library who support all of our programs, and we couldn't do this fun stuff without them. And I'd also like to thank Madeline because she let us share this program with other local libraries, and I think 21 of them signed on to it. And, when libraries work together, we just have a blast. So I'm really glad that we were able to do that. You can buy signed books from Madeline or by Madeline from Aesop's Fable. I'll put a link in the chat or I'll email it to you afterwards. Yeah, because I think the conversation will go by quickly and I might not have time. So if you have questions for Madeline, put them in the Q&A. That's a button at the bottom of your screen, your Zoom screen, and I will moderate them. And if you have things that you want to say to each other, feel free to do that in the chat. I will be paying attention to it, but it sometimes goes by too quickly for me to catch all the questions. So Madeline Martin, who, as she just said, just survived 2 hurricanes, as she lives down in Florida, has written the Book Lovers Library, which when I saw it on NetGalley, I just had to contact you. I don't even think I requested it before I contacted you because I was like, this is such a perfect book. And then looking at your backlist, and I will have stuff to say about your backlist, but welcome. Thank you so much for being here, especially having just survived a hurricane yesterday.
Thank you so much for having me. And I absolutely love that the Ashland Library really opened it up to all the other libraries around you as well. Having that bookish community is really just one of the best things ever. I mean, that's one of the reasons why I write about it, because I feel like when intelligent, empathetic, wonderful readers come together, beautiful things happen. And you guys really foster that community so much. So thank you so much for orchestrating all of this. And I know that you've put together some great questions, and I'm super excited. And thank you so much to all of the readers who are out there here to celebrate with us.
I know, book birthday is actually a big celebration because it's such a labor of love. So let's go into, first of all, the Book Lovers Library, because that's the book that came out last week. Can you tell us a little bit about it?
Yes, although technically, and it came out on September 10th, just because I don't want anybody thinking that they were looking up the wrong book. So,
September
um,
10th, not October 10th. Oh, sorry.
no, you're perfectly fine. Yeah, September 10th, which actually worked out well because I was able to finish up my book tour before having the opportunity to come here and get to do this. So, the Book Lovers Library is a heartwarming home front read that is set really at the beginning of World War II in a place called Nottingham, England. I decided to kind of deviate a little bit from London, and it's about a widow who has to send her daughter away during the children's evacuation in England when all of the children were having to be relocated from areas that could potentially be bombed. Now, I knew this was going to be a bit of a heavier topic, and so I wanted a setting that was a little bit lighter to offset that. And when I read about the Book Lovers Library, which was a lending library back in those days, obviously it had such a good title. I had to borrow it for the title of my book. And but this was during the marriage bar. This book was set during the marriage bar, which meant that when women got married, they had to give up their jobs to become full-time mothers and wives. And apparently the women who worked for the Book Lovers Library had statistically longer engagements than women in other areas of employment because they loved their jobs so much. And the more I started to research the Book Lovers Library, the more I found these amazing quirky patrons that would come in and frequent it all the time. And I thought, oh, these would make really fun characters. And this is really just a lovely setting for a book. And it offered exactly what I was looking for, sort of that levity to offset the heaviness of a mother having to send her daughter away during an evacuation.
Mhm. Yeah, and it's a beautiful story, but as you said, it has that both aspects of lightness and heaviness, but also family and friends and community and things like that, which I think is really interesting. But all of your books are set in the World War II era. Is that something that you had always planned as, like when you were a kid, were you always reading about World War II, or did you did you read other stuff and then come to it?
Right. Well, so the funny thing is I've actually I've written like 40 books because I had written historical romance before. So I did medieval, I did the Regency time period. And so World War II is I think I'm just a sucker for British history. And World War II kind of happened to coincide with all of that. But also my dad was in the army growing up. And so we had three different tours in Germany. And because I know somebody's going to ask this, I'm just going to go on ahead and say it was Darmstadt, Würzburg, and Bad Kreuznach. And it totaled about 12 years. And while we were over in Europe, my parents really loved to travel. And so we got to travel all over Europe and we got to see like these amazing, beautiful sights. And so I really feel like that really fostered my love of history. But growing up in Germany, there's a lot of education surrounding the Holocaust and World War II. There is very much a drive to ensure that what happened during World War II will not happen again. And I think because of having grown up learning so much about that, it really planted itself deep in my heart. And so I think that when I decided to really transition from historical romance into historical fiction, World War II just felt kind of like the right stories that I wanted to tell, especially as so many of these women's stories are sort of starting to come to light. And it's funny because, historically, women's stories really weren't told because it's funny, like when I was doing research for the Librarian Spy, which half of that takes place with a woman who worked with the French Resistance. And she worked with the printing presses, making those clandestine underground newspapers. And when I read about women in the French Resistance, they were like, oh, I woke my kids up. I made breakfast with the food that I could find. I dropped them off at school. Then I went and picked up explosives from outside the city. I dropped them off, ran some secret messages, picked up the kids from school and made dinner. It's just what I do. And it really was almost as like nonchalant, like, and this is, this espionage committed among my daily chores. Check off that to do. And so I think that these stories were almost kind of buried in this nonchalant attitude that a lot of women portrayed because they didn't see their efforts as being Herculean, and truly they were, especially, collectively and individually. And so having them really come to light has been an amazing opportunity for us to get to finally tell their stories and give them a voice.
Mhm. So I think, well, when I was saying earlier that I had some thoughts about about your books in the backlist, it really is that you have connected, World War II with women heroes, essentially, who, as you say, are just kind of going about their lives and also do this heroic work. But what I particularly love is the heroes are librarians, that through literacy and literature and storytelling create their, preserve and create reality, I guess. So what does that mean to you? Like when you're writing or when you're coming up with an idea, like how do you do that to do so many things in one place?
Oh, well, thank you. I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that I'm just a reader myself. I say that I've always been a reader, but apparently my mom says that they used to have to pay me a penny a page to read when I was a little girl, but I don't count, or that doesn't count because I don't remember it. And so, but for me, like reading it's such a huge part of my life where I'm always thinking about a book that I'm reading or that I want to read, or I'll even see something that's happening and think, oh my gosh, it's like this one book that I read that was just like that. And so it's something that maybe it's even a little bit indulgent for me to kind of write stories about books, but it's just something that means so much to me. But there are also so many stories about brave people who were librarians and booksellers that I feel like, again, these kind of fall along the lines of these stories that just haven't been told. Like with the Librarian Spy, that one is the other side of that is about American librarians who were sent into neutral countries to gather intel, like basically sending back pamphlets and books and that kind of thing. And these poor librarians, these poor hapless librarians really received like no training before they were kind of thrown in. And this book is set in Lisbon, Portugal. Half of it is at least. And Ian Fleming actually set one of his 007 books, Casino Royale, in Lisbon. And so that will give you an idea of these consummate spies that our poor librarians were kind of chucked up against, and I thought, well, if I was ever going to be a spy, like that would be me. Um, so But these librarians, they were very brave. They were brave and they were sent over and they knew what they had an idea of what they were getting into. And they were able to really muddle through it. And I thought that was incredibly brave. And then The Keeper of Hidden Books was set in Warsaw, Poland. And it was based off of these amazing journals that I found by Warsaw's public librarians about their life during World War II and the Nazi occupation, how they risked their lives to save books, and also how they operated secret libraries when all the public libraries were closed as of 1942. I mean, actually risking their lives. I mean, some of them actually did get caught and they did get killed for saving books and allowing people to come and get books in these dark times when they needed them the most. And I mean, those are stories of bravery that I feel like are so easily dismissed. And they're stories that are so important to tell.
Mhm. So why do you think that books, especially books and art, were taken away or hidden away or not allowed to be visible during World War II?
So there were a couple of reasons, actually. The first was the elimination of culture. So, for example, when it comes to specifically Warsaw and Poland, the whole point of their occupation in Poland was that they wanted to kill off 85% of the population. They wanted to kill off the entire population of Jews. They wanted to kill off 85% of Poles and keep the remaining 15% to be slave labor, essentially. And so they only let the children learn up to the age of until fourth grade, so that they only knew enough German to take orders. They got rid of all culture because they wanted to completely strip away anything patriotic about the people to really diminish their fighting spirit. And so the importance of making sure that people were able to still maintain that Polish integrity and keep connected to their roots was really integral to their being able to uprise and fight back against it. But then also, and I think this is so important, and I think, I'm in Florida, and so book banning is something that I am very passionate advocating against. Because when you look at book banning, the books that are being banned are predominantly minorities. They're LGBTQ. They are, books that people don't want us to read because they don't want us to have sympathy and empathy towards people who are not like the general public, I guess.
Mhm.
And the thing is, when you start to keep people from understanding other people and walking in their shoes and living lives that they haven't met, haven't had an opportunity to live, they're rendered faceless and nameless. And faceless, nameless people are so easy to persecute against.
Mhm.
And really, at its core, I feel like book banning is the foundation for prejudice and for all of the horrible hate crimes that really start to happen. So I feel very, very strongly against book bans, and I think that has a lot to do with it.
Mhm. And
Yeah.
so when you're writing, so let's stay with Book Lovers Library because first of all, I agree with everything you just said. It's just a bad for and for my perspective, and I think so many people's just a bad road to go down. But for Book Lovers Library, it was really like that. What was your main character's motivation to work? She wasn't allowed to. Was she being rebellious? Was she trying to make money? Was she like what was going on for her?
Right. So, the marriage bar, when that happened, it didn't just pertain to women who were married, it also pertained to widows who had children. Because if you had a child, basically your job should have been to be a full-time mother, which is great until you realize, hey, being a full-time mom doesn't pay very well. Not that it's not the best job in the world, but it doesn't really pay a lot of money.
Or at
And
all?
when I say that it was difficult for them to get jobs, it was like if you wanted one of the lower jobs, it was kind of like a like factory or something like that. You could get a job like that. However, they generally wanted people that were fresh out of high school, that they could have a longer career with their young eyes and young hands. And so if you wanted what was considered more of an elevated position, like a secretary or a teacher or, a librarian, then they had to adhere to these social rules. And one of those was that if you had a child or if you were married, you really couldn't work. And so Miss Bainbridge, who works, she's a manageress for the Book Lovers Library, she does take a chance on Emma. And she gives her the opportunity to work at this particular job because Emma basically is running out of money. She did have a pension that her husband had paid into, so she's welcome for me writing that into the story. But these widows' pensions and the pensions that the children received, it really wasn't very much at all to go on. It was really supplemented sort of by her inheritance that she had accumulated from her father and from her husband. But women who were widows with children basically had to rely on their families to help support them. Or the more obvious option was they just had to get remarried.
Mhm.
And it really is ridiculous looking back how limited they were. And so a lot of widows with children really suffered greatly. And when their husbands died, it was a very tragic turn of events for the entire family.
Mhm. So was it illegal for Mrs. Bainbridge to hire her?
It wasn't illegal, but I'm sure that if the higher ups had found out about it at that time, they probably would have frowned on it.
Mm.
I will say that the Book Lovers Library was one of the few places that did eventually start to hire war widows after the war. And so I kind of used Emma's character to segue into that. And it is fictitious that Emma, as a widow with a child, did begin working there. I just kind of wanted to have sort of like a historical motivation, even though it was fictional, for them to start allowing widows to work there, like war widows.
Mhm. And you said you went to Nottingham. What was that like?
Oh, it was great. It was cold. Like I said, so I went in March, and it's funny because I'm a Florida girl, and it snowed, and I was not expecting that. And I actually did have snow boots on me, but I got them because I thought it was going to just be cold. I didn't think that I would actually be using it for snow. But I'm glad that I definitely had them. But it was really cool because I got to see the first Boots Book Lovers Library in a Boots chemist was actually in Nottingham, England. And unfortunately, it is now a Zara. And so the inside is like these glossy white walls and halogen lights and has been completely stripped of its soul. But the outside is still lovely with this scrolling stonework, stained glass windows, and a clock tower on the corner. And it's really very beautiful. And so it was basically decreed in the 60s that all of the areas in England, like little towns and villages, really should have access to open libraries. And that was kind of the death of lending libraries. However, in Nottingham, there is still one lending library in existence called Bromley House, and they were so kind as to let me come in. It's been in existence since the 1800s. It's in a 1700s four-story townhouse, which is kind of built out into other areas. It's huge and it's beautiful. And they were so kind as to kind of let me come in. They explained how it all worked. They gave me a tour, and they also let me work there for the day. And there's this huge spiral staircase that goes down the middle that's apparently 200 years old. And it's a walk at your own risk because I guess it kind of moves. And I did not because I don't want to be the American that goes through and like destroys this beautiful piece of history. I just, not for me. But it was really cool getting to have that opportunity. And also, Nottingham has this amazing network of caves sort of threaded through underneath it, which is very uncommon. That's not really a common thing in England, but they did use it during the air raids and they would shelter down there. So getting the opportunity to go down there and just kind of get that feel for it, it was a really unique and incredible experience.
Mhm. So I know one of the things that you're very well known for is your research. So where in your life did you discover the Book Lovers Library? Were you researching another book and this was something you found and you were like, yeah, that's it. That's my next book.
Yeah, I was just nerding out reading historical articles. Like I just do that sometimes because I'm like, ooh, this looks interesting, and I'll start reading about it. And so what really kind of got me with the Book Lovers Library, aside from obviously the fabulous name, was when I read about the women who didn't want to give up their jobs to get married because they loved their jobs so much, even if they love their fiancés as well. And that's when I was like, okay, this sounds like a really interesting place. And so I kind of started to follow that vein. And that's when I started to really find a lot of stories about these quirky patrons that they would have come in. And then, of course, as you're reading about quirky people in real life history, the brain immediately starts spinning them into like caricatures and sort of these spin-offs of the real people into characters that I can make into my own story. And because I put a lot of work into my characters, not just the protagonist, but also the supporting characters. So even if they've had a couple of lines on a page, the odds are there's this entire dossier that nobody will ever even know about, where I've written their entire backstory. I know all of their hopes and dreams. I know about the worst day that they had when they were in third grade. I mean, I know what's going to happen to them after the book. Like I have all of this stuff. And so it really kind of helps build this foundation for those characters and sort of lets me build on top of that and create all of these fun characters that I just really enjoyed kind of getting to know throughout the process.
Mhm. And so one of the things that, keeps coming up in all of your books is community. And I love that word because it can mean so many things, but like in these books, the community is really the library community, like the within the library and the patrons that come to it or depend on it. So how did you come to like really exploring that aspect in all these four books that you've written? And I think the fourth one that we haven't spoken about is the last bookshop in London.
Right.
So that more of a bookshop community, but like the communities that's around books and book people.
Right. And actually, the book lovers library, see, I'm doing it now too. The last bookshop in London. The last bookshop in London was sort of the first one that kicked off sort of my discovery into how much I love writing books about books, especially in a historical setting. And really the whole purpose of the last bookshop in London for me was to be sort of an homage to the love of books and reading. And that one, it's funny because it starts off with Grace, the protagonist, actually not being a reader. And it's funny because I've had readers be like, how could you write a book about somebody who's not a reader? But the whole point of it is really that I want her to fall in love with reading and I want people to remember that beautiful experience through her eyes. And even writing it was an incredibly lovely experience, sort of getting to sit back and objectively think just about all the things that I love so much about reading and about books. And really the premise of the idea of the last bookshop in London came from this event that took place at the end of December in 1939 when during the Blitz, where pretty much the entire street, I'm sorry, 1940, December 1940, where Paternoster Row, which is basically the whole publishing district, they had warehouses, they had publishers, they had bookstores, they had all of these wonderfully bookish things. Well, it got bombed very heavily. It was a night where the Thames was at its lowest and all of the water mains were busted. And it took over 3 days for the fires to eventually burn themselves out. And over the course of that, over 5 million books were destroyed. And this was around the time of the paper ration, so you really couldn't just reprint all of those books. And so, it was one of those things that kind of got me thinking about bookstores and about community and thinking, well, what if there's this one small little bookstore that manages to survive? And what about the people who would work there? And what about the people who would visit there? And how could these people come together in such dark, horrible times? Especially a lot of these people were working full-time jobs and they also had volunteer positions on the side. And it really was just all about community coming together. And I thought, well, what if readers came together and they found hope through literature? And so that was really the foundation for the last bookshop in London. And then, like I said, I realized that I enjoyed writing it so much, not only the historical detail, but also just really incorporating a lot of these books that I've read in my life that have meant so much to me and threading them through the plot and sort of getting to revisit a lot of these characters and scenes all over again. That I kind of started running with it. And now I'm 4 books in. Well, 5 technically, if you consider the one that's with my publisher right now.
We will talk about that.
Yes.
Well, I guess what I love what you said about Grace is that she sort of discovered the love of reading and the love of that being with other readers as she explored her time in the bookshop. And I think it's really great because a lot of us don't remember the first time we actually really loved reading, but we just have always read, you know?
Right.
So to see
Yeah.
an adult like sort of really discovering that, I think is really wonderful. Um,
Thank you.
Eva said in the chat a little while ago that she lives in Middlesex library system and like the book lovers library is just like out all the time. It's kind
Oh,
of
well, thank
famous.
you. Well, and one thing I will say too, that if people have read The Last Bookshop in London and they loved The Last Bookshop in London, there is a small cameo from some of those characters that you love in the Book Lovers Library. And if you haven't read The Last Bookshop in London, it will not matter a single bit if you haven't when you read the Book Lovers Library.
Mhm. Was that something that people requested that they were like, oh, I love these characters. Would you ever write them again? And you're like, oh, well, maybe I will.
Actually, I mean, I have had people who have asked if I'm going to write a sequel based off of other characters in The Last Bookshop in London. Like Viv is a constant request, who's Grace's best friend, and she's bold and brash and kind of, got a little pizzazz to her. So I haven't done that. But when I was writing about the Book Lovers Library, there is a part where she ends up going to London because people with the Book Lovers Library, the actual lending library, would have to travel around to the different areas in England and do training in other stores. So when she went to London, I thought, what if she happens to end up at Primrose Hill Books? And it was maybe a little bit indulgent on my part to kind of get to revisit with those characters because it's like kind of getting to see old friends.
Mhm.
And my readers I've just had such a great response to it as well. My readers have absolutely loved it. And actually last December, and I'll be running it again for my newsletter subscribers as well. But I actually wrote a Christmas story for the Last Bookshop in London, just a really tiny, like little short story. It's not even a novella, it's really small. But just kind of like as a thank you to my newsletter subscribers. So this December, I will be sending that out again as well. So if anybody wanted to sign up for my newsletter, know that that's coming in December.
Okay. Um, yeah, Marie, she's my kind of person. I was introduced to the Plainville, Connecticut library by a friend when I was in first grade. I never looked back. I walked a mile by myself every week to trade in books for new ones. That was so me, Marie. I would,
Oh,
yeah.
I absolutely love that.
I think a lot of us, yeah. So like I think maybe part of that is why your books really touch us as readers so much is because we see ourselves in those people who are so heroic and they're using literacy to change the world really and
Right.
connect with people, to like connect with like-minded people. Um,
Yeah. Well, and
and
I know for me, libraries have been a huge part of my life, especially as a little girl. I mean, we moved constantly. Every 4 years we were moving.
me too.
And was your dad military as well?
For
Or is
anybody.
this getting too personal?
No. He worked for the Veterans Administration, and so we would also move every 4 years. And that was the one place I always look for wherever we moved to is the library.
Yes. Yes. I mean, I was just so painfully shy. I had such a hard time opening up and making friends. And I will say, I think that the experience made me a lot more outgoing. So there is that. I don't think that I would be the person that I am today if I didn't move constantly. But when I first went to school, I had such a hard time walking up to these friends, especially if it was in America and they'd all been friends since they'd been born. And
Mhm.
here I am, this interloper, kind of like, hey, can I be awkward and sit at this table with you and nobody talk to me? So, librarians were my first kind of best friends. I would find my way to the library. And the thing is, the librarians always had a new book that they could recommend to me that had a character that knew exactly what I was going through. And I could connect with them and not feel like I was so alone, even though I felt so ungodly alone when I wasn't reading that book. And it really touched me. Obviously I eventually made real friends. But the librarians always were my first true and fast friends because I would read like a book a day and it just completely opened my eyes to this connective experience that I didn't have otherwise.
Mhm.
So yeah, so you guys are seriously superheroes in my opinion. I'm just saying.
I left my cape in the other room. It is true that books and libraries and bookstores can really, and somebody else said in the school libraries as well, are places for people to connect, not just with books, but with people that like are the same as I said. But I do have to disagree with one thing you said, and it is that book friends are real friends.
Yeah, no, that is true. Yeah, I could see because they do, they really see themselves in your heart. And It's funny. I remember one time I was at a book club meeting, like an in-person one, and somebody had asked about one of my characters. Oh, why didn't they do this? And I said, oh, they would never do that. And she's like, that's so funny. It's like they're a real person. And I said, yeah, they are a real person in my head. But it isn't just the books that I've written, it's also the books that I've read where these people become like real people in my heart and in my mind. So
Mhm.
you're absolutely right on that.
Well, I do want to go back a little bit to the fact that you were a romance writer because I'm a huge romance reader, and I wonder how that influenced the current books you're writing, and what made that switch for you to go from romance to historical fiction.
I'd always really wanted to write a historical fiction. And I was very intimidated because, with romance, the number one, even with historical romance, the number one aspect of the book is the romance. It's the two broken people finding one another and healing their flaws together, and this arc that kind of joins and comes together as one. But with historical fiction, I would hazard to say that the historical research and accuracy is, in fact, even more important than the protagonist itself.
Mhm.
And that is very intimidating. And I knew that I enjoyed history, but the idea of that much research and finding ways to incorporate it in a way that's accurate and isn't just kind of over like heavy, was a little bit intimidating. And so I also knew that it was going to take time. Like, for example, with a romance, I can write a romance in 3 weeks. It is not a fun 3 weeks, but I can do it. With my historical fiction, it takes about a year. It's usually 10 months of research, a couple of weeks of going on site to visit in person, and then I usually have 2 months of frantic writing because I'm like, oh my gosh, my book is due in 2 months. I need to stop researching and finally actually write this book. Because I will also say that if I never had a deadline, I probably would never write a book. I would just get so lost in the research. But so it kind of goes toward my writing journey where I was writing romance. I started doing self-publishing, even with working with Harlequin Historical, because with self-publishing, you do make a little bit more money as a historical romance author. But as a self-pub romance author, you also have to write like a book every month or two to really be able to do well with it. And so I got to the point where I was writing 6 to 8 books a year for about, I think it was like 3 or 4 years. And I was still working my full-time job as a business analyst, doing SQL coding. And my daughters were in everything. And at the end of the day, above career and above writing, my family always comes first. And so, there really were about the whole time that I was writing and learning about writing and everything, about 10 years, where I probably only slept about like 4 hours a night. And so I didn't have the capacity to write the historical fiction that I wanted to. And I decided, okay, 2020 is the year that I'm going to do it. And around like getting close to that time, people at work started getting laid off because it just got really, work slowed down. It just happens. And I'd been with the company for 16 years. And I told my husband, you know what, if I get laid off, I think I'm just going to try writing full time. And he was like, okay, go for it. And so I was
He
like,
is
okay,
Mr. Awesome.
he really is. And so I got laid off. And I know it's like horrible to be excited about it, but I was so tired. I cannot even. Um, and so I thought, you know what? This is going to be amazing. I'm going to be able to really just dig into this historical fiction. I'm going to dig into this research. I'm going to have the entire house to myself. And like for of those 10 years, I'd say probably 8 of those 10 years, I was working in the middle of the living room. And there's no such thing as a deadline when you're a mom trying to work in the middle of a living room. I'll just tell you that. And so I thought this is going to be amazing. I'm going to have the house to myself. So this was February 2020. The pandemic happened like 3 weeks
Oh.
later, and everybody was home, and I got robbed. But it still did give me the opportunity to really dig into the research for the last bookshop in London. I remember I had somebody reach out to me after the last bookshop in London had come out, and they said, I'm surprised to see that you're so young because I thought that you had also lived through the Blitz because they had been a survivor of the Blitz. And apparently they felt that I was so accurate with my research that they just knew that I was a survivor as well. And that to me was like the most flattering thing that anybody could possibly have said. So even though everybody was home, I really got to delve into that historical research. And that's when I realized that I wasn't just a history nerd. I was also a research nerd. And I really just absolutely fell in love with the research process. And it's been It's been just so much fun. Every time I start a new book in a new time period or in a new location, it sort of makes me feel like Maria from The Sound of Music, where she's got her arms spread wide and she's just doing the spinning around in circles in the middle of the Alps. That's exactly what it feels like.
Well, maybe that should be one of your covers someday.
Right? Exactly.
So I have a comment here. Your books speak to me as a young woman who has enjoyed books my entire life. You also touch on the roles of these women during the war, courageous and daring during the times. They just love that. And then a question, Siram asks, all the protagonists in your novels are so likable and are people you want to be friends with. Have you ever felt an inclination to create a protagonist who is flawed and unlikable?
Oh, well, thank you. I really appreciate the compliments. So as far as my protagonist, it's actually funny because in The Keeper of Hidden Books, so my mom always reads all of my books before they end up going to print. She's kind of the last person to get to read through them. And she actually came to Warsaw with me and did that research trip with me, which was a really cool experience because I knew that she would read the book eventually and know how I had applied what we had learned together into the story. And so after she read The Keeper of Hidden Books, she said, you know, all of your protagonists have always been really sweet and really nice. And she said, but Sophia, she was so fiery. And my answer was, well, yeah, she's Polish. And really a lot of that stems from the character, and what she's lived in. When I do my research, I don't just research World War II. I like to research the socioeconomic and the governmental history that really leads up to that. So, for example, with Poland, for over 120 years, they'd been occupied by Russia. After World War I, with the Treaty of Versailles, when it was signed in 1918, they finally got their independence after over 100 years of fighting for it. They had just celebrated 20 years of independence when the Nazi occupation came in. And then after the Nazi occupation, they were under Soviet control until 1990. So this was a very rare pocket of 20 years worth of freedom that generations of people had fought and died for them to have this, and then it was stripped away from them. And so absolutely Zofia was a very fiery, very fierce character who is probably the most rebellious character that I've written. So I'd say that of all my characters, Zofia probably isn't the most sweet and kind. She definitely has got some fire to her. But as far as, making an unlikable female protagonist, I know that's sort of like a thing that a lot of us historical fiction authors joke about. I don't know, but I do know that, everybody also has their personal preferences and tastes. And at the end of the day, I always try very hard to showcase motivation for why my characters do what they do, which I hope is ultimately what will keep them from being unlikable.
I think Sophia was really likable though. Like she was fiery, but she also was somebody that we could really relate to because she was fighting for,
People
truth,
she loved.
the, Poland way.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
um, so not to take away from the fact that she's probably your.
No, no.
Um, do you want to go back to a question about World War II though? Because um, as a librarian, I know that like when All the Light We Cannot See and The Nightingale came out right around the same time, about maybe 10 years ago, 9 years ago, there was like this like the World War II stories have always been popular. There's always like this fascination about how the world could have been like that. But those two books really just propelled the interest like into the stratosphere. Did they or any other books like that have any impact on your the direction you went into for your writing?
Not really. I try really hard to not let myself be influenced by other books. I really just kind of go into it, sort of attacking it from my own perspective. And so even if I ever read any, it's almost to just kind of like an immersive experience as far as orienting myself in that particular world, how people say things. Like, whenever I'm researching a new time period, I listen to the music, I watch shows from that time period, I read books from that time period. And it's really just this collective immersive experience to sort of sink into my brain and put me into that time period. But as far as, oh, this one particular book did this, and I think that would be really incredible to incorporate. I try very hard to steer away from doing that. I try to just kind of sit back and enjoy it for what it is, and almost kind of like a pleasure read, whereas this is a business, and this is me focusing on the story that I want to tell and the way that I want to tell it without outside intrusion.
Mhm. Were there any other time periods that you were really interested in other than World War II when you made this switch into historical fiction?
All of them. I love all of them. So in fact, and I know that we're going to get into it a little bit later, but my next one is a Victorian. And actually, I just signed a two-book deal as well. So 26 and 2027 are also both going to be covered. And 2026 is going to be a book about the witch trials in the 1600s in England. And the 17 is currently unknown. So who knows where I'm going to pop up. So it is neat because I am kind of getting to delve deeper into history. I love the Tudor time period. I mean, there's so many time periods in history that I could just completely geek out on.
I feel the same way. I love history as well. So, but just to go back to one comment you made about the historical romances, is that I often felt like though the historical romance writers they researched so heavily as well, all of the ones that I've read. And I always felt like that's where I learned my actual history. I mean, you have to suss out like reality from,
Right.
whatever, but I did feel like I knew a lot. And so like it makes total sense to me that you would go from historical romance to historical fiction.
Yes. Well, and I'm so glad to hear that too, because I mean, before I know like so many other historical romance authors, and we all do so much research into our books. When I would start a new time period, like as I said, I know I did, medieval, I did like 1700s, and I also did Regency. And before I started writing in any of those, I would put in about a year's worth of research to really set myself up with, a solid core of knowledge that I
Mhm.
could pull from to write those books. And I will say also, like historical romance, historical fiction, I see them as sort of like the Tootsie Pop of the book world because you have brain candy wrapped around like this wonderful nugget of knowledge, and you get to really enjoy yourself while learning some incredible things. And that's one of the things that I've always really enjoyed about historical fiction and historical romance.
hmm But I also think that one of the things you do particularly well is bringing out stories that we were talking about this a little bit earlier that were not told before because before we were only getting a one perspective of,
Right,
I'll call it the winners, maybe. I don't know. They always say the winners write the histories, right? Um,
right.
but I think we're in this amazing era where people are starting to really write the fuller picture. And I think your books do a particularly good job of showing women an impact that they had in these really difficult times.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And there are so many authors that are doing that as well, which has really just been, so wonderful. It's so enjoyable to read and get to delve into.
Well, as a reader, I'm enjoying it. Um,
Same.
okay, so let's get into your writing a little bit because somebody does want to know, is that board behind you used to organize your writing thoughts? And can we get closer to it so we can see your book 17?
Oh gosh, sneaky, sneaky. So this particular board is actually all of my goals for the years. For the year, it used to be a quarterly thing, but I realized it was just made too much work to put all those little sticky notes together. So the top line is basically everything I want to do this year. The middle is what is in the process of being done, and the bottom row is everything that has been accomplished. And I always joke that the bottom is sadly never as full as I would like it to be. And I also want to point out that this last column is organizing my house, and you will see how very sad and empty it really is.
I organizing my house wouldn't even be on my board.
Well, that does make me feel a little bit better. Thank you.
But
I'm
that's
like, I have two sad little notes down there.
better than zero, right?
True.
So that brings me to the next question about your writing then is, are you a plotter or a pantser? Because you obviously plot out your year in goals.
Yes, yeah, I am very much a plotter. In fact, I like to joke that I'm so type A, I'm 12 point Times New Roman font. So really once I have done all of my research, and usually what I'll do is I'll do about like 2 or 3 months worth of research, and then I start planning my trip to wherever I'm going to go. And I've learned that it's best to just hire a private tour guide because you guys, nobody wants me on their group tour and be like, does anybody have any questions? And I'm like, oh, number one, nobody wants that. So I end up reaching out to tour guides and I say, this is the information that I have. This is the information that I kind of have holes in, and I would like more. And I've had people that have responded and said, you know more about my country in World War II than I do. You may want to go to somebody else. And I've had other people that have said, I know part of it, I can figure the rest out, and I'm so looking forward to meeting you. And obviously, those are the people that I go to. And so, getting to go on site, I feel like it takes this sort of black and white image in my head and it paints it with these vibrant, rich colors. And it just really lets me immerse myself in that experience. So when I go, I do these private tours. I usually walk about 25,000 steps a day because I try not to do public transportation. I want to walk those same steps every single day and see and feel what the character would have felt so that I can write about it. And then, I come back and I just really kind of flesh out more of my research. And then before I do any of the plot, although I feel like the plot is a little bit cheating because history is kind of like, here you go, girl. This is exactly what happened. But for me, characterization is so important with historical fiction. I remember one time somebody, I don't recall who, said, if you want to find out what happened in history, you read nonfiction. And if you want to know about how they felt, you read historical fiction. And so for that reason, characterization is absolutely critical when writing historical fiction because it really is, if like the setting is the most important part of the book, your character is the heartbeat that brings it to life. And all of your characters collectively. And so, like I said, that's when I really do put in a significant amount of work, not just with the protagonist, but also with the supporting characters and even the sub-supporting characters.
Mhm.
And so once I have all of those put together, then I do my plot, and the plot is extensive. It usually, if my book is about 100,000 words, the plot might be 20,000 words. So 20% of my book is essentially a plot that doesn't even actually count toward the writing of the book.
Mhm.
And then when I start writing the book, at this point, I've done so much research and I've familiarized myself with the characters so thoroughly that when I'm writing this story, I am completely and fully immersed in this book. All these authors post about their cute little pictures at Starbucks. And I want to be that author, but because I'm so like, I guess, immersed in my story as I'm writing it, I emote a lot. So if it's like an angry scene, I'm like scowling, If it's a sad scene, I'm bawling my eyes out. I've got like a mountain of tissue. Y'all, nobody wants to see that in a Starbucks. So I stay home with my cat draped over my lap, which by the way, I saw your cat earlier and adorable. Um, cat moms. So it really is one of those things. I actually kind of liken it to The Princess Bride. I think a lot of us have seen that movie where the grandfather is reading to the grandson when he's sick, and the little grandson asks a question, and the characters kind of freeze and answers the question, and then they resume once he starts reading again. And that's almost kind of what real life is like when I'm writing these books, because the story is so alive in my head when I write it. Thank God, because that lets me hit that mark when I have to turn it in 2 months.
Do you like some authors will say like by the end of the book where they read it and wrote it, read it, edited it, they just hate it and they don't even think about it anymore until after until it's actually coming out and they have to do the book tour. Having had that like cathartic experience, I'll say, of writing, crying, angry, whatever, how do you feel when you actually like give that book to your publisher?
Oh yeah. So, well, I when I write my book, I actually only do one read through of it before I send it to my publisher. So I've only really had to go through it once. However, they usually do 2 rounds of edits. They usually do 2 rounds of copy edits, and they usually do 2 or 3 rounds of proofing. And I read it thoroughly and completely every single one of those times. And at that point, I don't necessarily hate it, but I liken it to sort of overly chewed gum. When you chewed it so much that it's lost its flavor and it's just that kind of rubbery piece of a wad in your mouth. That's kind of what it feels like at that point. And you're just kind of like, okay, I'm done for a little bit. And then you get to go out there and you get to talk about it. And one of the things that's almost difficult about talking a book after it comes out is at that point in time, you have just written a new book that you are like totally jazzed up about. And like, in my head, I've got all these Victorian facts and all this stuff I'm so excited about. And now that I'm researching my book in the 1600s, I've got all these 1600s witchcraft, or witch trial stories and stuff in my head. And so it's almost like whiplash sometimes. It's like I'm on 95 and I'm going like 75 miles an hour and I flip my car from drive into reverse. But then again, also, then you start to think about all the characters and you think, oh man, Mr. Sanderson, he really is such a curmudgeon, but I love that old guy. And Mr. Beard, he's so quirky. And Tubby was just such a cute little dog, and you start to really almost kind of fondly think of these characters that have endeared themselves to you.
Mhm.
And just an FYI for all the bleeding hearts out there like me, Tubby, the little dog, stays completely safe. And if there are ever any animals in my book, they will always stay safe. I will never kill any animals because that is like my thing as a reader. If I'm reading a book and it seems like there's an animal in peril, I will actually go to Goodreads and do a search. And if the animal dies, I will stop reading the book.
Yeah,
So,
that is
so
also
I
one of mine.
promise to you.
Yeah, there's certain things you don't cross. That one and Secret Baby. Nope. No, thank you.
Yeah. Yes.
I do want to say that you can totally tell you're a writer because I could taste that gum in my mouth when you were talking about it. It had that like
Yes.
yucky like texture. Oh,
Yes.
you
It's
totally
like
brought
that, like
it
that,
to
like
life.
pale gray color. Like it
Yeah,
used to be
yeah.
pink,
All you
yeah.
doing is looking around for a tissue and you can't find one.
And you're like, I am not swallowing this. Yeah.
That's why they end up at the bottom under chairs so often.
Gross.
It's disgusting. But it totally like it was so like it just bloomed in my brain as you say and with so much description and not too much where I just got
Right.
disgusted, but like I could totally taste it. I'm sorry, I had to go there.
You're fine.
Lori asks, have you ever been hindered by countries or governments when you were doing your research visit, like not being allowed to do certain things, go to certain places, and not getting access?
Well, the pandemic did a great job of that.
Yeah.
So I actually did not get to go to London when I did research for the last bookshop in London because I wrote it in 2020. But I will say that having lived in Germany, especially my last tour, we were in Bad Kreuznach. And so we did go to London a couple of times during that particular time period. Admittedly, I was in my early 20s and going to bookshops was not the only thing on my agenda. There were quite a few pubs involved, but I still really was able to recall a lot of the experience of that. And I've always been like a bookstore lover. And so I really did sort of make Primrose Hill a compilation of all of these like quaint little bookstores, these dusty bookshops of piles of books and this disorganized chaos. I really did kind of use all of those little bookshops as an amalgamation to create Primrose Hill books. Um, and when I was researching the Librarian Spy, I needed to go to Lisbon, Portugal, and to Lyon, France. And they were not open at the same time, which I feel like actually kind of worked out well because I feel like if I did both of them together, they may have blurred.
Mm.
But so Lyon opened up first. So I got to go to Lyon, France. And then I did a second trip to Portugal when that opened up, actually around the same time that France closed again. So I'm glad that I didn't try to marry them together. But from a government perspective, I haven't been barred from anything as far as visiting goes. But what I did have to be very careful of when I was writing about the Keeper of Hidden Books, my research, if I had any of my research that was written in Poland prior to 1990 and translated into English, I could not use that book because of Soviet censorship. Because of the fact that Union was still very much in control in Poland at that time, so I had to be very careful with purchasing my books. And I have over 100 nonfiction books that I use for writing The Keeper of Hidden Books. And every single one of those, I had to go through and see where it was published before I even purchased it. So one of those like small, quirky little things that, that you don't think of, but really is impactful. Yeah.
Mhm. Well, it's interesting to me because the Soviet Union is not in charge of Poland anymore, but they're still able to censor the books written
Oh, well,
during.
that was up to 1990. If it was published after 1990, it was fine. But 1990 was essentially when Poland established its independence again.
Right, but like are the Soviets or the Russians actually like watching to see if you took out a book from 1989 and and
Oh
most.
no, not for me, but the content would be compromised.
Oh,
Right. So
interesting.
they like if a book was written in Poland prior to 1990, the Soviets would have had to approve it with their censorship. And
Wow.
the content that they would be discussing would be compromised by censorship by the Soviets.
Hmm.
And then, of course, that would be translated into English because the book is translated as it is. And so I had to ensure that books that were published in Poland prior to 1990 and then translated into English were not being used as part of my research because it would have been lacking in factual information.
Oh, sorry. I totally had a senior moment.
No, no, you're fine.
I was like, okay, so I have two last questions for you. One is, what draws you to European history versus American history?
I think a lot of that comes from just having spent so much of my youth in Europe. I feel like I really kind of put down roots. And also like, I mean, Europe has so much cool old stuff. Like, I mean, just driving through anywhere, there's like, oh, what is that crumbled building of stone? Like, that looks really cool. There's just so much like, we really just call it cool old stuff whenever we go on these trips. Oh, look, it's something old and cool. And like when you go to these places, these historic places, the tour guides are so passionate about what they do. And
Mhm.
so when they're telling these stories, like I immediately revert to this little girl that's just like, story time, I'm here. And I'm like all in. And so I really think that growing up and having that experience and learning about kings and queens and like all these people and all their different roles and how these relationships all worked and the craziness of the bubonic plague and how it completely revolutionized the economy and all these different aspects of life going back deep into the heart of history, it was just such a neat thing to learn about. In fact, when I ended up coming back to America, I ended up in St. Augustine, Florida, because it is the oldest city in America. And I am a total history nerd. So it's like I found the deepest, rootest, oldest part of history to really come and live in America. And so I think that it really is that rich history that keeps drawing me back to Europe because it just continues to fascinate me. Yeah.
Yeah, no, um, I mean, we all have our own reasons for doing things, and I just wondered if there was any particular draw there. But yeah, living there, I think would make a huge difference,
Yeah.
especially Germany, because I think that, as you said, Germany has such a thing with World War II, and
Right. And even beyond that, even just like the witch trials that they had there. And there's like so many castles that are from like the 1300s and the 1400s and there's just so much history there.
Mhm.
And it's really just it's just been fascinating for me.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And it does seem like a little bit of a warlike nation. Like they've had so many wars through all of those periods, um,
Right.
to understand the people and their hardiness and things like that.
Right. Yeah.
So last question. I do want to know about this Victorian book and the Salem witch one.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, so the next one that's coming out in 2025 is the Victorian era book, and it is called The Secret Book Society. And it is about a young countess who has been widowed 3 times. And yes, there is absolutely some gossip surrounding that. And she finds out that other noble women are having their reading materials suppressed by their husbands. And so she opens up her library to these women to come over and read books. And then they have these teas where there's of course gossip, there's of course a discussion of books, but the topics also lean to very subversive sort of ideas. And these women who all think of one another as having these perfect lives realize that they're all absolutely imperfect. And they all sort of, it's a very like women helping women book. And it's got a mystery. It has all of my favorite things about the Victorian time period. And I can't get into too much details about it because it's still about a year out. But I will say that as of September 2025, you are cordially invited to the Secret Book Society.
I will be there because that sounds amazing. I love books where women help women. I
Thank
think,
you.
yeah. And then the witches. I know you're starting to work on that, right?
Yes, so this is very, very new. And it's interesting because I'm actually doing a dual timeline, which is the first time that I've really done this. Which is funny, like 40 books, and I'm just now, this is like the first real contemporary book that I'm sort of writing-ish because part of it is contemporary. Where one woman lives in Savannah, her name is Lilith, and she's a contemporary heroine, and she is linked to a woman through magic. So it has some slight magical realism to it as well. And she is one of the victims of the witch trials in England that is kind of happening on the heels of the bubonic plague. So it's very, very new. I haven't worked on a very compelling pitch for that one yet, obviously, but I'm really delving into all of the research, and it's been so much fun because apparently all of these really old texts are available for free online. And so I'm able to find all of these amazing theses that people wrote, pamphlets from like the 1600s that were passed around during the witch trials. It's just, I'm so nerding out on this. It's the coolest thing ever. I'm really excited about the research.
Oh, that's so fun. I mean, it's fun that you love the research that much because that sometimes, some people think it's a slog and I think it's fascinating. But I also
Yeah.
think, I don't know if you're going to do sort of like a juxtaposition in your research around like the European versus American witch trials, but they were pretty different from my
Yeah.
understanding. So,
Yeah, they were. They were, but also part of the European ones also did influence part of like specifically the Salem ones as well. Yeah.
yeah. So,
Yeah.
I mean, whoever we are, wherever we are, we can certainly connect to like our own, like what's happening here and happened over there. But oh my gosh, this has been like the best hour, Madeline. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. I've absolutely enjoyed myself. Thank you for just chatting history and everything with me. I really enjoyed it.
Well, I could do this all day, but I know you
Thank-
have like kids to put to bed, but maybe. No, you have older kids. Anyways, I really want to thank everybody who's been here with all of your great questions and the chat, which I've really enjoyed. And I hope you read Madeline's books. They're amazing. And I will email everybody with the recording as well as how to buy her signed books. So I hope you all have a wonderful night. Madeline, I hope you don't have too much cleanup to do after the hurricane and that we look forward to all of your future books.
Thank you. And thank you so much, Mina, for all the great questions. Thank you for the readers for coming out today and also for Aesop's Fables for bringing my books and supplying those. And I appreciate everyone so much. And I hope that you have a lovely evening.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye,
Bye.
everybody.